Hello and welcome to Crossing Borders with Nathan Lustig, where I interview entrepreneurs doing startups across borders and the people who support them, with a focus on companies that have some relationship to Latin America. I first met my guest today, Brian Requarth, at South by Southwest back in 2011, where he was on a panel talking about his experience co-founding VivaReal, Brazil's largest property portal. Think of it like Zillow or Realtor.com, but for Brazil. Originally from California, Brian always had a passion for traveling and entrepreneurship, and he put those two together when he set off on an adventure with a friend of his, driving all the way from California to Costa Rica, then on to Colombia. When he realized that working as an English-speaking call center attendant in Bogota only paid $300 per month, he knew he had to start his own business, which he did by knocking on doors in a used suit to get his first clients. After building multiple businesses that targeted both the US and Latin American market, he realized he needed a scalable business in a big market and decided to move VivaReal to Brazil, where it's grown from 4 employees to over 600 today. We talk about how he got his first investor and mentor, what it's like starting up in Brazil as a foreigner, how he was able to raise $30 million in venture capital and expand to take over the Brazilian market. Brian's experience is unique because he's done business all across Latin America and was able to build a big, scalable business in one of the harder markets in the world. It was great reconnecting to hear his story, and I hope you enjoy my conversation with him as much as I did. Hey, Brian, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Nathan.
Thanks for taking the time to do it. So where are you in the world today?
So I am in Santa Rosa, California today.
Very nice. And are you from California originally?
Yeah, I am. I'm from just a little bit west of here in a small town of 7,000 people called Sebastopol. And I live here most of the year in Sonoma County.
And so what's your main business that you're working on today?
So today, the company that I started and was CEO of for about 7 or 8 years is VivaReal. And VivaReal is an online real estate marketplace focused on the country of Brazil. So we're the leading property portal with over 5 million property listings and 20,000 customers that advertise on our platform to the almost 20 million visits a month, people searching for real estate across the country.
So how did a guy from a small town in California end up running a property portal in Brazil?
Good question. It's not the first thing you think of in terms of what you do with your life, end up in Brazil building a business. But the kind of journey that took me down here was in 2003, a buddy of mine, we got in our car, drove from California to Costa Rica on a kind of a little journey trip. And then I bought a one-way ticket to Bogota, Colombia. And usually, I'm no exception to this, but usually there's a woman behind a lot of these stories. And my wife today, we met in California, and then I went to go visit her in Colombia. And then my plan was to stay up for a few months, and then 3 months turned into 7 years. We got married, and then I ended up starting a few different businesses in Colombia. And finally, several years later, our business has evolved into what the business is today, VivaReal.
That's the classic story of ending up in Latin America and getting married.
Yep, that's what happened. I guess I'm cliche at this point.
And what made you and your friend decide to do that car trip, the road trip, all the way down to Costa Rica?
Yeah, my goal was actually to get down all the way to Patagonia. So I guess I almost made it, given that Sao Paulo was kind of our headquarters. And that's where I ended up spending 6 years after Colombia. I eventually moved to Sao Paulo and launched the business in Brazil. But really just like an adventure. It was a good friend of mine. We traveled to other places together, and we had graduated from school, and we saved some money up, and it was kind of just like our time to take an adventure where we didn't really have any other responsibilities, and it was the moment to just kind of like branch out and do something a little crazier. So that was the motivation of the trip, was just kind of discovery.
And had you been to Latin America before?
So yeah, I actually spent a fair amount of time. When I was in college, I ended up studying in Costa Rica several times. I lived in Buenos Aires for 6 months, and I traveled to a few other kind of countries. So I had quite a bit of exposure, and actually studied Spanish in college. And so, I didn't really know what I was going to do with it, but I knew that, communication is kind of an important part of doing business. And I always had kind of a few business bones in my body that were, I always knew that I would kind of gravitate towards entrepreneurship at a young age.
Were you the type of person that, was always doing different entrepreneurial things growing up?
Yeah, I did quite a bit of, neighborhood type stuff. Yeah.
What kind of stuff, or what was the most fun?
I'd say the most kind of fun and successful thing I did as a kid was in high school, I started two things. One was a sports camp. So I had like these kids that would come over. My brother and I had kind of both sports guys. He played tennis. I swam. And we basically had swim lessons, tennis, and a handful of things. So at a pretty young age, we started the sports camp. And then I also taught swim lessons at our house because we had a pool. And so that was kind of my opportunity to make some money in high school. I think over one summer during the peak, I had about 80 students throughout the summer that I taught swim lessons to. So it was good money for a 16, 17-year-old.
Oh, that's cool. And so you're pretty entrepreneurial and adventurous, sort of more than the average person in the US. Why do you think that was?
I don't know, maybe just personality, like kind of curiosity. And, I don't know what I attribute that to. I'd say definitely like some influence from my parents. We traveled a lot as a kid, so I had a lot of exposure. So I guess it's when they were wishing that I was back home and not so far away, I kind of let them know that might have been their fault, getting all the exposure that I had as a kid on family trips. So I'd say that was kind of a factor. And then, I think maybe personality wise too, I've always been kind of curious and really enjoy kind of putting myself in positions that are maybe like not super comfortable, just so that there's an instant learning process involved.
That's interesting. And I think that probably what fits well with why you ended up starting different businesses.
Probably, yeah. It's probably part of my personality.
So you ended up in Colombia going to visit your now wife. What was some of the first businesses that you started there?
So when I moved there, the natural kind of thing to do was, well, first of all, I needed some money because the savings were dwindling and I couldn't really get a job. I think I actually went to a couple of job interviews. I went to a job interview, I remember, at a call center, and, it was serving like English speaking, people, that took the call center in Bogota. And I remember I did the test and it was just like read a paragraph in English. And I'm like, oh, that's pretty easy. Everyone was really nervous and all I had to do was read a paragraph in English. And I got the offer, I'm like, and then when they told me what the salary was, I think it was, at the time, it was like 700,000 pesos, which is like $300 a month or something. I was like, yeah, I don't really want to work for someone else for $300 a month. So the natural kind of next step was to teach English, given that I knew a lot of people would want to learn English and I needed to make some money. So I started a little company called English Without Borders, which pretty cheesy name, but we ended up, getting a couple of customers. And originally I was teaching the classes, and then I found out quickly that I wasn't a very good teacher, and I hired some other people to do the classes.
Were you teaching corporate clients
or
were you teaching just individuals?
Yeah, primarily corporate. Like I had some individual students, but then I kind of weaved my way into a couple corporate contracts. It's kind of a funny story. I had the only suit that I had, which was from the Salvation Army. I think I paid like $7 for it. It was like a little short on the cuffs, but it was, it looked nice. And, Nordstrom suit looked nice, looked pretty clean. So I walked in to the biggest building on the 7th Avenue, which is, the kind of the main center for economic center in Bogota. And I kind of weaseled my way in past security. And I just basically made a stop at every floor and tried to, to kind of sell them my business English courses. I think I'd look at the name of the company and try to determine if it was maybe a multinational company or, and I remember I got to what I think was like the 16th floor, and it was a stock brokerage, and I somehow ran into the head of HR in the waiting area, and I was able to schedule a meeting to present to them. And then I ended up getting my first contract, and that was a way I sustained myself for the first almost year. And I hired someone else to teach those classes, and I think I taught one class. It worked out. It was a good little deal in the beginning.
So you were literally knocking on doors to get your first clients.
Yeah, definitely just floor to floor, and it was a lot of people that said no. And then I finally got to the 16th floor and was able to coincidentally run into the right person.
How many people do you think said no before you got to that yes?
I don't know. I mean, it was definitely a large number, because I remember I stopped at most floors on the way. So maybe there was 2 companies on each floor. So some people just wouldn't let me in because I usually get shut down at the front desk.
Yeah, the classic in Latin America where you can't get past the secretary.
Yeah, exactly. They're ¿Quién eres?,
Yeah, they're tough. So what did you do? Did you start another business after that?
So after that, and it's kind of funny, that actually leads into how I met my co-founder. I had this contract with this stock brokerage in Bogota. One of the executives at that company wanted to take German classes. And so he asked me if I knew a German teacher, and I didn't, but I just kind of, noted that. And I guess it was like the next week I was paying a fine in DAS, which is Departamento de Seguridad, I think it's called in Spanish, basically like the INS, immigration. And I'd overstayed my visa, my tourist visa. And basically what happened was I saw a guy in the waiting area and he had a German passport. So I kind of just struck up a conversation with him because, I said, by chance, you don't want to teach some German classes. And so he said, maybe I want to extend my stay, so I need some extra money. And so one thing led to another. We ended up meeting up like the next couple days, and we both found out we had an interest in technology companies and entrepreneurship. And he had more of a product engineering background. I had more of a sales and marketing background. And we kind of put our heads together and started our first company that was called Colombia Connect. The idea was just basically to build websites. And that was in 2004.
That's really interesting. So that's one of the more unique co-founder stories that I've heard, meeting in the passport line to pay a fine.
Yeah. So it was kind of serendipitous and kind of a funny, he was paying a fine also for not having the proper stamp because he came in across the border, whatever, something silly. And so we were in this like extremely bureaucratic place, right? And, waiting in line for hours. And then it just, one thing led to another, and we struck up a conversation. And then pretty soon after that, we became business partners and, kind of thought of a bunch of different things that we could do together. And then, that's that.
So for the website business, were you selling to the local market or were you selling other places?
So when we started off, we tried to sell websites in Colombia, and we just realized that this is 2004. No one was willing to pay anything. Our first website we actually sold it's kind of a funny story. We sold, there was this place called Unilag, which is basically where all the computer supplies are sold. And it's like a kind of a mall for just computer supplies. But most of this computer supplies they're not really like registered, all the transactions are like cash, and it's kind of a little bit of a shady place. And I remember I met one of the shop owners and we wanted to build a website for him. And so we ended up selling a website, and it's a lot to build like a kind of an e-commerce website. So we were able to find like a templated OS commerce website, that we basically bought the template and then adjusted it to his needs. And, we got our first check for that. And then I went to show up the next day, or I guess it was the next week after we'd kind of adjusted everything, and kind of present it to him and collect the second half of the payment. And the guy had already like shut down his operation. He wasn't even there. And so that was our like moment where all right, maybe we need to think about our market. Like, what's the market that we should be addressing? Because this doesn't seem like it's a very solid market. And so the natural thing after that is, basically just like we evolved to thinking about selling in the US, and your natural inclination is just like start contacting people, right? So we kind of dug into like people that either I went to school with or friends, family. And coincidentally, I just contacted a place that I worked in high school. Every Christmas, I would work on a Christmas tree farm. And so I contacted the Christmas tree farm, and that was our first website that we actually built. So it was a website for a Christmas tree farm called Frosty Mountain Trees. And we built a website for them. So very random. And then everything after that was just like random websites that we would do. But again, we kind of realized that wasn't a very like scalable, sustainable business. And I think it took us about 9 months, maybe a year, to realize that we should focus on something that we can be more scalable. And so that's when we actually kind of transitioned the business into focusing exclusively on building real estate websites. I had worked at a company when I was 19. I dropped out of school and worked at a startup that built real estate websites for agents. And so we basically kind of copied that model, but our main differentiator was that we built them in Spanish and English. And then we targeted real estate agents that serve the Spanish-speaking population in the U.S.
It's a good model of being able to take advantage of knowledge you had before from real estate, plus also being in a Spanish-speaking place, so you could have that competitive advantage.
That kind of allowed us to leverage. So we ended up cold calling these real estate agents it's kind of funny. We actually took the list of all of the real estate agents on like Realtor.com, and we looked for all the names that sounded like they were Spanish, Gonzalez, whatever. And we just would contact them, and it was our way of assuming that they might be servicing the Spanish-speaking population in the U.S. So we built that business for a couple of years and built it up to like maybe 15, 20 people eventually became profitable. But then in 2008, the real estate crisis hit, and that segment of the population got hit particularly hard. And that was when we kind of realized that we had to reevaluate and also migrate to a business that wasn't just building websites, but we needed to generate value and leads for those agents. And so that's when we actually kind of evolved to VivaReal and are thinking of more of a marketplace model rather than individual agent websites.
So if you were doing agent websites in the US for Spanish and English speakers, why did you first go to Latin America with VivaReal rather than thinking US?
We actually didn't. We actually started off with VivaReal.us because I didn't have the domain .com, and we built a bilingual marketplace. So, it was around the time Zillow and Trulia and these other real estate marketplaces raised a lot of funding. And so we wanted to focus on that niche. And we actually we did pretty well initially. And I was on the board of the National Association of Hispanic Real Estate Professionals. And we kind of, we were able to carve out a little niche, and we actually started that a little bit before the kind of the real estate crisis. So we had kind of, when we were building the websites, we realized that we needed to migrate to a marketplace model because, we weren't generating enough value through the websites. And so we needed to figure out how to generate leads. So we consolidated the properties into one central marketplace. And we started that in 2007, just in the US Hispanic market. And then we started simultaneously looking at Latin America. And we launched another website, which was VivaReal.net in English, focused on the expat community in Mexico, Costa Rica, kind of the Caribbean, those people that look to buy properties in Panama. And we launched our VivaReal marketplace in those local Latin American countries, but in English. So that was kind of the evolution of it all. Started with the Spanish in the US, and then we thought about Latin America, but doing it in English. And then we just really realized that, we should be more focused on my original idea. Actually, I read a case study from Mercado Libre from Stanford, and I was like, wow, this is a really big business. And I saw that a huge proportion of their revenues came from Brazil and a few other high value markets. So our original idea was to become this, kind of Mercado Libre of real estate, where we would launch all these marketplaces in every single country. And then we soon realized that that's super difficult, and being in multiple countries is very difficult. So we decided to then become more of the Amazon, focus on high value markets. Let's build them in Mexico, Colombia, Argentina, Brazil. And then we launched, 3 websites, I think, in Brazil, Mexico, and Colombia. And Brazil really took off at that point, and it was kind of growing it much faster. We brought on a co-founder in Brazil that did extremely well. And then within 2 years after that, after we launched all 3 websites, we decided to go AAB, all about Brazil. And that's when I moved to Brazil, and we shut the other sites down, relocated our Colombia office to Brazil. And then we decided to just singularly focus on the largest market.
Can you talk a little bit about the challenges of operating in multiple countries across Latin America? Like, you were in Mexico and in Colombia and Brazil all at the same time.
Yeah. Well, it's just in our business, given that it's got a little bit of a brick and mortar component in the sense that you need to meet with the real estate brokers. And so there's an on the ground piece. It's just complicated to be managing multiple currencies, multiple legal challenges of, having an office, employees, and it's just really complicated. It was something that I kind of knew, but I look back and wish that I had been I knew instinctively that we needed to focus on Brazil and a high value market, and it became more apparent over time. But when I looked at the size of the market and I saw that there's more real estate professionals in the state of Rio than the entire country of Colombia, that was kind of I sat down and I wrote this analysis, kind of an assessment of, what the opportunity cost of being in all these countries is. And I just think it took me a long time to kind of pull the trigger on exiting those markets, but just the complications of different languages, in this case, Spanish and Portuguese, multiple legal entities, currency, all those things are just make it really complicated. Also, given it's not just an online play only,
How did it feel as a founder and also with your team making that decision to close off Colombia, where you'd gotten your start, and then make the jump to Brazil?
Yeah, I agonized over it. And it's one of those kind of decisions where, it was something that I worried about and I felt bad about. And, and then we finally made the decision. And we laid off almost everybody in Colombia, and we gave a handful of the best engineers an opportunity to go with us to Brazil. And I think we ended up taking 4 of the engineers with us. And what was really complicated was, just having the concern and feeling like, that you're kind of letting these people down. What I soon realized, and, with a little bit of time after that decision became clear, is that everybody really absorbed fine. And I just last week talked to one of the people that, worked with me in Colombia, and she worked at Mercado Libre, and then she's looking for, a new job now. But like her position in all the other companies in the last 6-7 years, she's done extremely well. One of the other guys that I worked with is now leading, small, medium businesses in Brazil for Facebook. So like you worry about those things, but in fact, I think we ended up being a good jump off point for other people. And I think that if I could go back, I wouldn't have agonized so much about it and been a little bit more just kind of not delay it as much as I did.
Yeah, I think that's one of the interesting things that I've seen with US and European founders that end up in Latin America is just the fact that you're bringing in a lot of knowledge of how do startups work in the States or in Europe, and then teaching that to your employees. Then they end up going on to working for amazing companies after that or starting their own thing.
Yeah, and where it is today, like where the startup ecosystem is, like there's just a greater demand. So all those people having had some experience, given that there's not like a ton of people that have had operations experience in a startup, they actually, it's attractive whether they join another startup or a big company, because big companies are finding themselves like needing people that are startup people to kind of affect change.
So I talk to a lot of mostly Latin American entrepreneurs that come either are in our portfolio or are applying to get funding from us, that they know that they probably should go to either Brazil, Mexico, or the US, but they just can't seem to pull the trigger, can't seem to be convinced to do it now. They want to wait a year, or they want to wait a year and a half, or whatever it is. What advice would you give to them about, one, what they should think about, and then 2, why they should pull the trigger faster?
Yeah, I mean, it all depends on everyone and their stage of their life, right? And their risk tolerance and like whether they have families and all those other things. I mean, I was very fortunate that I had an extremely patient wife that was like down to go on the journey with me. But I don't know if not everyone has that kind of situation where they're, able to have someone that's willing to kind of, go on that journey with them. But if you're like, really young and you're single and you don't have any kids, I think that it's a no-brainer to, if you're an entrepreneur, to go out and just like test the waters and move to another place. And there's a window where it's like the risk is extremely low and the reward is really high, not from a financial standpoint of like a successful business, but the reward of life experience and just the growth that's going to happen. So aside from all the financial opportunities of building, a business in one of these larger countries in Latin America and the potential there, it's just an incredible experience for a young person. And the growth is accelerated 5-fold probably by just picking up and having to start something in another country. And there's just all these learning experiences that you can't experience unless you go do it.
So let's talk a little bit about those first learning experiences that you had and the life experience of moving to Brazil. You didn't speak Portuguese yet, did you?
Not really. I had taken 2 semesters randomly of Portuguese. I traveled to the country and like realized that I could, since I spoke Spanish, that I could like kind of communicate a little bit. And I've always been like a real traveler and lover of culture. And so that was something that I knew I had a kind of an ability to pick the language up, but I really didn't speak much. I struggled in the beginning in particular it's frustrating. It's extremely frustrating to try to communicate what you want. And Brazil isn't exactly a place where everyone speaks English. It's not like, I don't know, Costa Rica or, somewhere else where there's maybe more kind of Panama, more exposure to foreigners.
So what was the first step? You arrived, you and your co-founder, with 4 engineers from the team in
So
Colombia.
The first step was in 2009, before we actually kind of exited the other businesses and we launched in Brazil. I was fortunate enough in 2008, I'm reconnected with Diego Simon, who is Brazilian, and he reached out to me randomly on LinkedIn. We'd studied together in Buenos Aires, and he took the class list and just like added everyone on LinkedIn. And so I got his message and I'm like, oh, I was headed to Argentina for Christmas and New Year's was going to be in Brazil. And I was already decided on launching this business in Brazil. And so I ended up, getting this message, and I'm like, hey, like, thanks for reaching out. Like, I didn't really remember him. He didn't really remember me very much, but I had an interest in Brazil since I was planning on starting a business there, and we'd already getting ready to launch the website. And so I just kind of like, hey, I told him, hey, we're looking to do this. And if you know anyone, or if you have any advice or any feedback. And he proved to be like really proactive and interested. And, he's been working for his family company, but he wanted to do something more entrepreneurial. And so he kind of just did some like pro bono work for us for a few months and like, researching things and translating stuff. And then Thomas and I kind of looked at each other and said, hey, Diego's great. We should figure out how to bring him on. So we ended up giving him some equity and making him a co-founder of the business that got us started in Brazil. And that was in 2009. We launched the website like in April, May 2009. And he spent a month, the first quarter of 2009 in Colombia with us. We sent him back kind of on a handshake and a little bit of money to cover the first 3 months, and kind of went to town. So that was, from that standpoint, he was able to kind of like do the initial things while I was, kind of supporting him, managing the engineering. My co-founder Thomas and I managing the sales and engineering and everything in Colombia, building the product. And then we had a website in Mexico. But so it was a 2-year period where I would just travel to Brazil. I would talk to him, fly down, stay at his apartment for a month, and, sleep on his couch, all that stuff. But then in 2011, when we decided to go AAB, all about Brazil, I moved indefinitely in January 2011. But he was really critical for the first 2 years in particular, and afterwards. But the 2 years where we didn't know anyone, we didn't know how to set up a business, I didn't really speak the language very well. So hiring, everything. And so he was like an absolute kind of critical piece to that.
And had you raised any money yet at that point?
No, not really. Yes, an important kind of like person in this story is also my college roommate. When we were in San Diego, we both kind of had this, like, we did a lot of entrepreneurial kind of stuff together, started a few little micro businesses in college. And so we both like were really supportive of each other's kind of entrepreneurship. And he actually left while we were in college. He worked on a business plan, moved to London with another roommate we had who was Dutch, and they started a ticket marketplace. The business ended up doing really well. They bootstrapped it. They raised, a couple $1 million, and they sold it to Ticketmaster. And the transaction happened kind of right before all the whole like crash. And he made a bunch of money. And, at that time he was 27 years old and didn't really know what he wanted to do. And I had been talking about kind of the transition from building websites and real estate websites and marketing to more of a marketplace model. And we launched our website in the US, launched our website kind of the expat market in Latin America. But we need to like fully transition our business to this marketplace model and launch in these countries. And so he actually, along with myself and my dad, the three of us financed kind of the transition of the business, and very painful kind of like every month, each of us would put in like $7,000, kind of cover the costs and the transition. And we really bootstrapped it for quite some time, with the exception of some family friends money. I think we raised like maybe a couple $100,000 at that point. My friend James that had sold the company, he put like kind of an irrational amount of money in at that point. He wrote a check for, I think, $250,000. And so, we didn't take any institutional or any kind of like professional investor money. A handful of the people that maybe gave us checks of $25,000 that were like friends and family. And the first kind of like more official round we did raise like our two kind of most critical investors that we got outside of the family friends were two people. One guy by the name of Simon Baker. Simon Baker was the former CEO of a company in Australia, does the same thing we do. Today it's a $6-7 billion market cap company. And he was the CEO during 8 years. And in 2008, 2009, when we were planning on launching VivaReal, I contacted him and I pitched him. I can tell you a funny story about how that happened and what the results of that was, but basically it didn't pan out. But I kind of harassed him for a couple of years, and I finally got him to write a check. And once I got the former CEO of this big company in our space to write a check, the other kind of investors were easier to line up. Simultaneously, I'd been talking to this guy named Greg Waldorf, who today is like a real key mentor for me, and he's on my board. he was one of the first investors in Trulia. And so he knew the space a little bit. And so he kind of invested right around that time. And then after those two guys invested, it was much easier to raise money. I think our first kind of AIM round was a little over $1 million. And then, we kind of followed on with some institutional capital after that.
So yeah, I want to hear the funny story of how you got the guy in Australia to invest.
Yeah. So I'll tell you how I didn't get him to invest first. Since I was kind of a rookie and definitely didn't have a lot of knowledge about talking to investors or raising money, I reached out to him randomly on Facebook, and surprisingly, he responded to me. He had just left his post as CEO of this big company. It was $1 billion company. And I said, hey, I see you're going to be speaking at this conference in San Francisco. I was in Colombia. I said, I'd love to meet with you. And so he responds to me. I'm like, oh crap, I got to get a ticket now and go meet him in San Francisco. So I flew out there. We had a meeting at kind of an informal chat at a cafe. And we scheduled a follow-up meeting for a couple of days later. And I was to go deeper into our plans. So in our second meeting, I think James Gray and I, the guy that had invested some money already in the business, we kind of put together a plan, and I had been memorizing a bunch of data points about Latin America from Wikipedia, very, shallow kind of understanding of the business. And basically at the time we had this crappy website with 20,000 visits for the US Hispanic market. And we're going to build this big business in, all of Latin America. And so at the end of the conversation, he'd taken notes throughout the whole chat, and he asked the big question. So how much money are you looking to raise? What's the valuation? And kind of swallowed, kind of took a big gulp and pulled a number out. And I said, we're looking to raise $1 million at a 6 million pre. And he kind of looked up at me from his notebook, kind of paused, looked back at his notebook, slammed the notebook shut. And he's like, yeah, I think it doesn't make sense to keep talking. And he abruptly kind of got out of there, reminding me that we're in the worst kind of economic crisis and the real estate market is in the dumps, and, you're crazy, basically. So that was kind of I really felt like I blew it. And the seasoned veteran I was at the time, I literally got on the phone and called him later, and I said, hey, Simon, how about 5 million? Thinking that I could just drop the valuation and he'd be all over it. And, he wouldn't return my phone call after that. So that was my kind of harsh reality and kind of rude awakening to trying to raise money. And basically I ended up kind of harassing him for 2 years after that, 2.5 years. And it kind of comes around full circle because in 2011, I think in January, I finally told Diego, I said, hey, Diego, let's just bring him to Brazil. Let's just, hire him as a consultant, and we'll kind of learn from him. And so we invited him down. We had an arrangement where I would pay him $5,000 or something to spend 2 days with us. And a week before he arrived, at this time I was sleeping on Diego's couch. I said, Diego, how the hell are we going to pay this guy? I'm not paying myself a salary right now. We don't have a lot of cash. Can't really afford this. And so we had the idea of creating an event 5 days before where we would basically, invite all of the top real estate companies to hear this kind of world-renowned speaker. We kind of marketed him as, the leading expert in real estate marketing and technology. We invited all the top companies, held an event at a hotel, and sure enough, 100 people showed up, paid an entrance fee. We even lined up some sponsors. And so I think that was, after I'd been harassing him for 2.5 years, trying to get him to invest. When he kind of came down, saw Sao Paulo, that it's a huge city, and there's, these companies and they're willing to pay to hear someone speak. I think he saw the opportunity, and he ended up writing us a check right after that. So, and ironically, it was almost the same valuation that I originally asked for.
That's an amazing story.
So kind of full circle. And more important than the money, this guy ended up being just an incredible resource for us. As part of his investment, I locked in 6 visits to Sao Paulo. And every time he would visit, we would just go deep dive in the business. And he really, really lined out an amazing playbook for us that we followed to the T.
Can you talk about the importance of having somebody like that, either on your team or that you can call up for your startup?
Incredibly valuable. I'd say both those two guys were just amazing resources for me. Greg and Simon, they were great mentors. Simon was very specific on execution stuff. So that was really helpful because as an entrepreneur, you're constantly thinking about, is this the right thing? You're doubting yourself. And I think that what it did is alleviated some of the doubt and some of the discussion and speed is one of the most valuable assets of a startup. And so it helped us kind of move quickly and not overthink things. And I mean, I remember one time when one of our big competitors ended up buying a company, which was a data provider, and they would send the properties to the different portals, and we had a lot of listings from them, and they bought the company. And I was like, oh crap, like this is, we're kind of screwed, because what if they cut off the listings, et cetera? And basically I called him, and I forgot that he was in Australia. And so I woke him up in the middle of the night and I said, hey, Simon, this happened. They bought this company. And he said, can I go back to bed now? And so it was a real, nice kind of reminder that like, just the experience and the knowledge, he was able to communicate, hey, this is not a big deal, and here's why, and just don't lose any sleep over this. And so having those kind of mentors and guidance was really critical.
Can you talk a little bit about scaling a business from pretty small to very big in a country like Brazil? What are some of the challenges that you had to overcome?
I mean, scaling wise and going from this, I think that there was definitely a clear moment for me where I realized that this is like a company that is, bigger than originally thought. And I think as part of that process, the moment when you realize you don't know everyone's name anymore is, right around like whatever, 50 people, 60 people. That becomes kind of like this, this feeling where you're just like, oh, feels like it's a startup, but it's not like a project. It's a company. And some of the things that I wish that I had done better in retrospect, and I think that we were very obsessed about the culture in the company, and I think we did a good job, particularly in the early days. And then I think there was a gap where we, probably like scaled really fast, and, we raised a lot of money. So when we piled on the big rounds, we just hired like crazy. And I wish that I would have gone a little slower, but also just really remembered the importance of the culture and continue to communicate like we used to when we were 30 people, 40 people, 50 people. We would have constant kind of all hands meetings with, and it was like everyone would just get in one room and we'd talk about progress and we talk about what's important. And that was something that we just did constantly in the beginning. And I think when we got bigger and we had multiple offices, and that became something that was just harder to do, or just required a different strategy. And I think there was a gap of like probably 18 months where I feel like I just kind of dropped the ball on that I wish I would have done a better job of. And then we ended up like kind of going back to that, maybe in 2014, 2015. And it was like, it became super focus, emphasis, and we kind of were able to recover that. And it was good that we had a good foundation of culture, like at the very beginning, because, those things become, when you don't you don't water the grass for a little while, the roots were there. And so like the roots of the tree were good, but there was some tending that needed to happen. We need to do a better job of kind of taking care of those things. And so that's one thing that we struggled with. I think most startups, have some issues around that are growing really fast.
And how many people did you grow to from, you said around 30 to where it started to become a big problem?
We went from like 50 to 200 really fast.
Yeah, that's fast. That's a lot of people.
In 18 months.
Do you have any specific strategies that you would have wished you would have used at the time that you think other people that are going to go through similar sort of scaling would find?
I would just encourage people to like continue the conversation with the company about, we had always a culture of like openness and transparency. And so like just communication is one of the things that most painful, I think. And so just like continuing the spirit of openness and communication about, what's important. That's something that I wish I'd done a better job as CEO. I wish that I'd kind of put that front and center and not been so obsessed with the growth, even though, it's easy it worked out for us, right? But I think I just, could have done a better job of that. Other things like, I think that's like the number one thing for me is just the constant communication about those things, particularly to like the different leaders of the teams, and just like emphasizing those things, because what happens is you create this like separation of you and then the other people that you hire that are a few direct reports away from you. And so it's hard to kind of maintain control if you don't really obsess over making sure that this is like front and center for the business. And then I guess another thing is that one thing I started doing more was just like going deeper in the org and having more conversations with people deeper in the org, which I think is important to do, and not like lose touch with that. and like, hear people's experiences kind of deeper down in the org, where when you have like, there's several like direct reports between you and someone else, you tend to just like, some people are good at managing up, but they're not good at managing down. And so you don't really realize that until we're managing to the side. And you don't really realize that until you kind of like go down the org. So I wish that I'd probably done a little more of that I think that I started doing that at one point, but I think that's important. Other things that the scale kind of, not forgetting to communicate the purpose around the company and not losing sight of that. And, the people that joined the company in the beginning, they kind of know it. And you got to make sure that you create one, multipliers, but two, that you're continue to be the voice there.
And how many people are employed at VivaReal now?
So throughout our like company, VivaReal, and then we've acquired 2 companies, and then we have another company that we've kind of incubated. We're about 600.
So did you have a similar sort of growing pains going from 2 to 6? Or now that you had already gone one big jump, it was more or less the same?
It definitely doesn't get easier. It only gets more difficult. I'm still kind of reflecting on all these things, and it's still like, I'm at a moment right now where I've recently become the chairman of the company. In the middle of last year, about a year ago, I moved from CEO to chairman. And so I've had more time to think about it. And I talk to the CEO very often, and I go to Brazil every kind of 2 months and spend time with the team there and go to board meetings. But, I think I'm still kind of in this like reflection stage right now of what are the things that I wish we had done differently, and what were the challenges kind of in that. One of the things that, and I don't know if this is like more of a specific problem that I struggled with, but I think that for a non-technical kind of CEO, just like the project engineering piece is really hard. And everyone I talk to almost that is, that's building a tech company, they struggle with their ability to kind of execute and build the team properly and have the right kind of accountability. And I think that's something that I struggled with a lot as CEO. And I think that really it took us maybe a year ago, like even when I was kind of on my way out, maybe like the last semester before I left, for us to kind of start figuring out and doing a better job there. But I think that building that kind of layer of management is really hard. My experience was that, a lot of the engineers, they didn't like this management piece, and there's like a resistance there, and particularly as a startup where like the needs are different in the beginning and the way you scale is different. You can't, when it's just a couple people building a product, it's just easier because your communication's there. You can go sit down and talk to other people in departments, and it's just like information flows much easier. And then people also have like they shoulder more responsibility. And as you grow the organization, people become more finite in what they focus on. And you need to figure out a way to kind of scale. And so the management layer is super important. And so I think that I did a really bad job of that. And I think it's funny because throughout the organization, there's like phases, I feel like, where we were more kind of tightly micromanaging teams in the beginning because we had like focus was so important because we had limited number of resources. Then when you raise money, you have this like influx of capital that basically allows you to do more things, or it gives you the illusion that if you have twice as much money, you can do twice as much stuff. And that's a dangerous kind of proposition because you really can't double your capacity overnight. It's something that just like you kind of inch along rather than snap your finger. So that was hard for us to like get the right balance and stay focused. When you don't have money, staying focused is super easy because you die if you don't focus.
Let's talk about some of the capital that you used to grow the business and start to make it go faster. So you raised money both from local institutions in Brazil and from abroad, right?
Yeah.
And so can you talk about the process of deciding to do both Brazil and abroad and what that was like?
Well, I think that like the way that I think about the capital raising for the way I thought about it for VivaReal was I think of 4 different buckets. I think of the first bucket as those Simon Baker, Greg Waldorf, like people that were angel investors that could have an impact in a couple different ways. One, Simon, in my case, he had the operational expertise. And so we gained all kinds of insight into how to build a business. Greg had more of like an experience as being a CEO, mentor, and also could really help with stage financing because he had connections with deeper pocketed VCs and he had credibility there. So those 2 buckets were really important kind of initially to set the right kind of foundation. And then on top of that, the recipe that I kind of found, and a little bit of retrospective rationalization, because, I like to say that I had this like vision of all this, but really just kind of instinctually started coming and happened by chance in some respects. But the necessary component of having a local investor, given that I'm an American doing business in Latin America, in Brazil specifically, there's some challenges, and wanting to have a local partner was really critical. And so the way I thought about that was I was fortunate enough to find two really good local investors in Monashees and Kazek. Monashees is a Brazil-based fund. They've been around for a while, and they're definitely a top-tier fund in Latin America. And Kazek is, those guys from Argentina, the former Mercado Libre guys. And, they're also top tier. I'd say those are the two top funds in Latin America. And they bring different things to the table. And so I was able to line up what I consider to be the best funds that would kind of block other potential companies. And I was able to leverage the local contacts of Monashees in hiring and the experience of Kazek in building a business at Mercado Libre to lean on them products and just other insight into building a company. And so that was kind of the other bucket, was local investors. And then the fourth bucket would be, institutional capital that could provide deep pockets. And, we've raised money from several hedge funds. And in fact, what's been a nice cherry on top is that sometimes with this late stage capital, you don't really expect much besides money. But we've been really fortunate to have investors that not only are just, have access to capital, but they're also very engaged, and they're helpful in a lot of different ways. One of our investors, Valiant, there's a partner there named Eduardo, who's been he rolls his sleeves up and, looks at challenging problems, and, has been a big help for me. And some of the other funds have also kind of been able to assist in a lot of ways. So, I kind of looked at it in those four buckets. Operators, another guy, Sean De Gregorio, was the CEO of iProperty in Asia, in Malaysia, Singapore. So he was also an investor. I flew out and visited him while he was CEO and learned a ton from him. Simon, operator. And then the other bucket, Greg, seasoned angel investor, CEO, and great help with access to stage financing. And then local partners to help with recruiting and all those other things. And then the deep pocketed investors. So there's kind of those four buckets.
What advice would you give to the founders that maybe have raised, their first sort of seed rounds for maybe Magma portfolio companies that have raised seed round from us and maybe are looking for that next kind of growth capital? How should they think about doing that when maybe they have bases across Latin America?
I think my advice, and if I were to be a US investor, I would probably, most US investors would be co-investing alongside a local fund, right? So I think it's really critical for a local fund to have, to be really involved, because I think that the US funds find comfort in that. And there's, funds that kind of have a reputation of being able to have a good track record. So I think that partnering up the local fund in market is really important, I think. At least it was for me. And that's probably even more important for a first time entrepreneur. And, there's other general thoughts on this. Obviously, you want to find great investors that can help in different ways. But more than anything, you just want to find great people. The partners have to be just great people that you respect and like. Of course, one of the challenging things is if you're struggling to raise money, you can't really be as demanding, right? You kind of just got to if you need money for your company and your business requires growth capital or venture, and unless you're really killing it, it's hard to just walk up and raise around really easily. So, but if you have choice, then, you want to be selected with the type of investor and understand the philosophy of the investor, understand kind of what their objectives are, what their expectations are. I think those are all great conversations to have. And those are fine conversations to ask the investor so you can kind of better understand what the mentality is. But the best thing to do would be to ask other entrepreneurs what they're like to work with and gauge, because the entrepreneurs are the best. That's why these funds, their reputation really hangs on the experience that the founders have working with them.
Going back the other way, what about U.S. investors? Why should they be looking at companies that are doing business in Latin America like yours?
I do think that there's an incredible opportunity it's in its infancy regarding kind of the ecosystem. And so it's undoubtedly there isn't a ton of companies like there is in the US or in Europe that have matured, but, it's kind of a frontier market. But, if you look in Brazil, there's, you've got 99 Taxi, which, took in 200 million recently from, DD and a few other funds. There's, Nubank, big company. There's a really handful, and in the other markets as well, in our space, Mercado Libre bought Portal Inmobiliario. I think they paid a pretty good amount of money for that. So there's definitely activity. And I think that from an investor standpoint, I would say it's less competitive to get into deals. And from that standpoint, I think that there's a growing number of entrepreneurs that are building businesses not only for like their country, but for the region and for the US. And so I think it's definitely an attractive market. I think that if you're going to invest, I would come in with the mentality of committing to the market and committing kind of for the long term. And I think it's a matter of time.
Yeah, I think you're right on the matter of time. I mean, it's just clear that tech will eventually do what it's done in the US and Europe and Asia and Latin America, and it's already sort of starting, and just takes a while to get things to really start to go.
Yeah, I'm definitely, next 10 years, I'll be investing much more in Latin America, probably.
And so what advice would you give to yourself going all the way back to when you were first starting that first business in Colombia, knocking on doors in the office tower to teach English, knowing what you know today?
I would say probably the stress that mounts up, and maybe not just in that first business, but like all the different businesses and all the pressure that you put on yourself. I mean, I think that from one standpoint, it's like a great motivator, but I think that I wish that I'd been a little bit more healthy in my kind of living sometimes, and the kind of psychological kind of anxiety that's created for an entrepreneur. Like I wish I had a little bit more clarity that things would work out, but you don't really know that. And so maybe I wish I would have developed better mechanisms, and probably wish I would have the only people I could talk to were a friend of mine, family, and I didn't have a lot of people that I could share the experience with. And so I think that's one thing that at an earlier stage, I would have found more of a group of people that I could count on to share and be vulnerable with, so that I could kind of offload some of the stress and get reinforcement that, hey, this is going to work out. This is someone maybe that had experience going through the same thing I did that could tell me that there's light at the end of the tunnel and that's not a train.
And do you have any books, blogs, or podcasts that you would recommend to people that helped you through your journey?
The single most impacting book that I read is The Hard Thing About Hard Things with Ben Horowitz. I mean, it just I still go back to that book. I still revisit some of the chapters. And it actually just really when I read that book, it kind of devastated me, because I had realized that I was going through a lot of the same things, and that I, was not really taking care of myself, and that the stress level kind of exploded when I read that book, because I'd been kind of suffocating this difficulty and not exploring it and releasing some kind of stress. And so it was just building up over years. And even though on the surface the company looked really successful, there was a time where I really realized that I was struggling, and then I needed to figure out a way to kind of deal with that. And so the struggle's real. And I think that just hearing someone else's perspective allowed me to know and understand that I'm not kind of alone in that. And so I think that would be one of my advice. So my advice to other entrepreneurs is that the struggle's real, and that, finding people that have been through that, whether they can be your advisors or get someone on your board or somebody that can speak to that through experience, will be an incredibly valuable opportunity for you to weather the storm.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, that pretty much everybody that has gone through that started a business. And that's one of the goals of this podcast, is to get the stories out of people that are operating in Latin America. And pretty much everybody has that same sort of story, where they didn't really know who to talk to. They're putting all that stress on themselves, and just took a long time to sort of be able to, as you put it, be more vulnerable with someone else, either on their board of advisors, other entrepreneurs, or even just with family and friends.
Yeah. It's hard when you have investors too, because you don't want to show weakness. So you've got to figure out a way where you can, find and surround yourself with people that you don't want to have to totally fake it till you make it, because that's it's a hard thing to kind of maintain forever.
Yeah, it's impossible.
Yeah.
So what's next for you and for VivaReal?
So company's going great. I can't talk about some of the details, but, we've continued to grow at a nice clip despite the economic situation and political situation in Brazil. So we've got some exciting stuff on the horizon, but really my focus all along has been just build value. And if you do that, good things will happen. So I can't speak to any specifics, but we're in a great position right now with kind of a solid balance sheet and a big market and growing. So I like the prospects of what we're doing. My time is spent, primarily on VivaReal, but I'm kind of taking a sabbatical from an operations role right now. So I'm just kind of evaluating what I'm going to do next. And in the meantime, just continue to support the CEO at VivaReal and the team. So we'll see what happens. But, probably next year I'll think about what I want to do next and see if I have another business in me or what. I'm not making any decision right now and enjoying this time where I'm not, in the day-to-day of building a company, which, is taxing over time.
Yeah, it's good to take a break.
Absolutely. Family time for now.
For sure. So you mentioned one thing about, the political and economic situation in Brazil. And what we see, Chile's had a much less sort of severe economic downturn, Argentina also, Colombia. And what we've seen with our companies is it's actually an advantage because you can get really talented people that otherwise would be working for high salaries in bigger companies. And the bigger companies are actually, they have to watch what they were spending on marketing or watch what they're spending on sales. Have you seen that similar thing in Brazil?
I would just make a comment about that. The great thing about the last kind of 5 or 6 years even is that there is an evolution of people that have gone from, working at like the big banks and consulting firms to kind of embracing the startup world. So what you didn't see 7 or 10 years ago is people like really, really smart, capable people joining those startups. And now, it's kind of cooler to be in a startup. And that, given that the economy isn't as strong, people are kind of willing to take more risk, I think. And so I definitely think that part of it is culturally, like it's more acceptable and it's become cooler. And 2, like the number of opportunities in banking, for example, has diminished significantly. So those people that would typically go into that field are more attracted to the startup and they're willing to take equity and invest in the project. So I think that's something that's definitely kind of evolved over the last, 5 years, I'd say.
I think that's right. And it's really building upon the foundation that companies like yours and Mercado Libre and others across Latin America have started to put down so that the next generation can start to come up. And I'm pretty bullish on the Latin American ecosystem. Yeah,
me too, man. I believe, and as you said, it's a matter of time and it helps to have those success stories. Mercado Libre is an amazing trailblazer, but there'll be other companies that, follow in their footsteps. And, like in our case, we were inspired by Mercado Libre when, that was kind of one of the ideas we had when we read the case study. So it's a snowball effect and it's a maturity of the ecosystem. But it's in its early years here, but, a good time to be there.
Yeah, I think you're right. Well, thanks again for taking the time to be on the podcast. I really enjoyed hearing your story. It's been fun because we have a portfolio company that the founder who was on episode 2 of the podcast has like a very similar story to yours in that he's building websites and from Argentina for the local market, then the US, and then did a property portal. Not nearly as successful as yours yet, but it's very fun to hear that you guys have kind of followed the same trajectory. Appreciate you taking the time.
Oh, absolutely. Thanks a lot. And yeah, good luck with everything. And let's stay in contact.
For sure. Have a good rest of your day.
Right.
Thanks again for listening to this episode of Crossing Borders with Brian Requarth from VivaReal. I hope you enjoyed his story. If you did, please feel free to give me a rating on iTunes and on Stitcher, and think about subscribing and recommending this podcast to a friend. Thanks again.